Welcome to the Coast Podcast, bringing you timely insights and strategies to succeed in the ever-evolving world of school system technology. On each episode, you'll hear from certified education technology leaders, visionary district change makers, and instructional experts who will discuss the technology topics making a difference in schools today. And now, enjoy today's show. Welcome to another timely episode of the Coast Podcast. Today, we'll be discussing trends in K-12 education and looking to provide guidance on bringing innovative solutions to the classroom. I'm your host, Ross Romano, and my guest today is Tom Davis. Tom is a former middle and high school bilingual science teacher, a coach, administrator, grant writer, businessman, and lifelong learner. He currently serves as the Director of Business Development at the Center for Educational Innovation in New York, and previously it was in the same capacity for both the California Association of Latino Superintendents and Administrators and the Association of Latino Administrators and Superintendents, which you might know better as ALAS. Tom's role is to keep ahead of EdTech trends and identify solutions that will make a positive, transformative, and sustainable impact on K-12 education, which is a perfect fit for our discussion here. So Tom, thanks for being here to share your insights.
Thank you, Ross. Looking forward to the discussion.
So why don't we get right into it with a question about the vision of kind of the trends of where education is headed and where we think it'll be. And, over the next kind of 5 years, based on the trends that have been happening, many of which have perhaps been exacerbated by the pandemic or, even brought into a new perspective, where do you see things headed over the next 5 years?
Great question, Ross. Thank you. Personally, I believe that the pandemic really has done some interesting things to all of us in education. It's an opportunity for us to really make things different. And if we don't, then shame on us. But the things I see that are positive are moving towards social emotional learning, which we should have been doing all along, more of that. And I often tell people if I was to go back to the classroom, I would shift my focus to assessing what kids' strengths, their values, or interests are before I could teach them any kinds of biology or any topic at all. So I would often lead with that and then figure out how to motivate students based on what they're interested in. So I think there's going to be a shift in that. And I think there's going to be a shift towards the world of work. There's some great work being done right now by Dr. David Miyashiro and Ed Hidalgo in Cajon Valley School District around the world of work. And they lead with Holland's work on the RIASEC, and each kid understands their letter, if they're realistic, if they're intrinsic. So I think you're going to see starting a movement towards making school more practical and real world, because kids ask the question, why am I taking algebra?
Right.
And
Right.
So oftentimes I think we have to understand, we take a student's perspective, but at the same time, really, really understanding that the key person in that classroom is the teacher. We've got to provide more support and constant resources for our teachers, because at the end of the day, EdTech's not the answer. It's that classroom teacher.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, those are all really positive trends too. Not only trends, but good ones, right? About really establishing and understanding and better supporting that connection between school and the workforce, and having students understand the practicality of what they're learning, which of course in turn forces educators to think about, okay, why are we teaching this? Why are students learning this? Okay, now we're all on the same page. That learning is a lot more engaging, and students learn a lot more when they know from the start, this is why I'm learning this and this is why it matters. There's just a lot more ownership, and that is a trend that we've seen a lot of, and it's a really good thing. And another piece that kind of fits into all of that is the concept of innovation, which I think is it certainly can be an overused buzzword, and a lot of companies, product providers, et cetera, refer to themselves as innovative without necessarily establishing what exactly does that mean, and why are we innovating. But when you think about a school, in this case, we'll start there. A school that you would define as being a particularly innovative learning environment that is really implementing meaningful innovation. How do you define that?
So for me, innovation is really all about people. It's about the entrepreneurial spirit. It's about thinking like a futurist, in my opinion. In 1989, an article that I read at ASCD by Marina Gorbis talks about 5 basic principles of thinking like a futurist, which I've always thought of myself as a progressive teacher and was always looking to build new things for my classroom and making mistakes. I wasn't afraid to make a mistake. But the 5 main principles that Marina Gorbis talks about are, forgetting about predictions. Don't be able to predict the future. You can't do that. But look for signals. You got to look for signals and trends that you talked about, and then looking back to go forward. What did we learn from the past so we don't make the same mistakes going down the road? And uncovering patterns in systems and systems thinking, and then creating a community. Because all of us in education, we're terrible at sharing what we do best. I mean, I think that's one of our biggest problems. We work in isolation. We don't share what we do. So there's pockets of things going on out there really cool that are innovative. And I've been espousing for the last 25 years, 30 years, that every single school district should have an R&D center, much like big companies do, to try new things. And we thought that was going to be the charter school system, which was really, I thought, years ago, was going to be our hub for innovation to try new things. But unfortunately, that got political and changed things. But I think schools have to have a mindset of, let's create R&D centers. Let's always be looking for the next cool thing that's going to be focused on teaching and learning. It's going to empower teachers, it's going to empower parents, students, and the community. And so my definition of innovation is going to be whatever you want it to be, but it's going to be people-centric. It's going to focus on what's good for kids.
Yeah, and that all comes back to that why in that case, and it starts with the kids, the students, what's best for them. You mentioned the concept of empowerment and empowering different stakeholders, which is something that I think we've seen some positives from even in the past year or two here with a lot of remote learning, where it has given parents and families the opportunity to be engaged in new ways and to have some stronger connections between school and home. It was forced in a way with the pandemic that wasn't exactly what everybody envisioned. However, some positives came out of that to say, look, this actually is pretty good, right? When families understand what's happening in the classroom and they can be involved. And really that why is that equity piece. And you mentioned things like charter schools. And I think everything starts there in a lot of ways to say, okay, a lot of the reason we want to do new things in education is because we need to find more solutions to meet the needs of more kids, right? And there's a lot of students and there's a lot of different needs and a lot of kids who are in a different geographic location, or they learn best in a certain way, or they have certain academic needs, or they have certain interests in what they want to do after graduation. And we need to be supporting all of that. How do we make sure that we're maintaining that link between innovation and equity, basically that purposeful piece, and making sure that our new approaches are designed to enhance opportunity for all?
That's the work that we've been doing at CEI over the last 30 plus years, is focusing on underserved, under-resourced communities that need more support. And that really is how CEI got started, through an Annenberg grant years ago in the DOE in New York. It's always been about equity. It's always been about supporting those that need those resources. And so I think one of the other areas that you touched on, Ross, that I believe in is going to make a huge impact, going back to our earlier conversation, is going to be the parental involvement. We're going to see a lot more of that. I think that's the other piece, and the community piece. Those are two big, huge pieces, I think, that will make sure that there's equity, because voices will be heard. And I think that if you look at taking on a futurist mindset and getting teachers to understand that it's not about the tests that we're preparing them for, it's about taking each individual human being right there and cultivating in them a sense of lifelong learning and to be adaptive souls. In other words, when these kids get out of high school, they're going to have 10, 15 jobs. So our job should be, and this is from a quote from a good friend of mine, Dr. Tony Smith, which resonated with me when we had this discussion about our role as educators. Our role as educators should be to eliminate bias and create opportunities. And that resonated with me when he told me that. And that's going to be my new mantra as I move forward. Think about that statement for a second. Our job as educators is to eliminate bias and create opportunities. And I do think with the concept of blockchain and the idea of every kid has a portfolio, the other idea that Tony shared with me was a movement towards educational blockchain. Everything that we do should be put in some portfolio that we carry with us for the rest of our lives, that we can show people what our strengths and our values and our interests are, and it's all right there. And so those are some concepts I think that make a lot of sense. And it's always about equity, diversity, and inclusion for sure for us in our work. That's what we've been about for 30 years, and we're going to continue down that pathway. So everything that we look at, because let me share one other thing with you. When I was in the classroom teaching, high school biology, but bilingually to level one students that didn't know English yet, they were very, very smart kids. But in that classroom, I had 4 different types of learners in there. And I was one of those teachers that was trying to accommodate them in the 90s by personalizing their instruction. And so what I was doing was taking into account that I had an English, they're all English learners, but I had a kid with special needs in my classroom. I had a gifted and talented kid in my classroom. I had, regular kids, so how do you accommodate every one of those learners in your classroom? I took that very seriously. So I was really trying to, individualize the instruction, whatever the topic would be for every one of my kids in the classroom. And that's been carrying over now, what we call personalized learning or individualized instruction, right?
Right.
So gives you an example of I've always been about equity because the kids I've worked with have always been underserved and underrepresented.
And so much of that is one, the intentionality. There's a lot of collaboration involved in that. We've talked about parents, families, educators. There's also different educator roles within the building, within the district that can help to support those needs. And there is so much of that communication that keeps coming from a lot of this too at every level. It's that common language between stakeholders to establish, okay, we have the same goals and we know that we have the same goals, right? You mentioned social emotional learning a few times. There was an interesting study that came out just recently from the Fordham Institute about how a really high majority percentage of parents are in favor of social emotional learning being a part of schools, but they're not necessarily a fan of that term. They prefer life skills, right? That was by far the most popular. So that's the kind of thing, right, where it's encouraging to know, okay, we all want this, but let's just make sure we're talking about the same thing. Let's make sure we know that we're working toward the same goal. And in so many ways, having that communication and taking the time to establish that is really going to be beneficial, because now everybody's rowing in the same direction and feels good about it. So within schools, when we're talking about creating these types of innovative, equitable learning environments, there's a lot of stakeholders. So who are kind of some of the stakeholders, and more importantly, how can they work together? For example, how should tech directors and principals be kind of working together, or teachers and ed tech specialists? Because there's so many opportunities there that are in, I think, really effective districts. A lot of that is happening, but it's not discussed as much in these kind of forums. We usually are speaking to one audience or the other and not necessarily having that dialogue about, well, actually, everybody should be working together. I mean, do you have some thoughts on what that dynamic can look like?
Absolutely. I think first of all, it's a great point. It starts with leadership. It starts with the leader of the school system, essentially creating a culture that we're all going to work together on behalf of children. And I think that's the key. And then creating that culture where we're all in this together and not working in silos. And I think, one of the positives that I've seen in the last 5 years is the movement towards the whole child, teaching the whole child and getting data analytics to support everybody, all the stakeholders, that are involved, parents and the teachers and the site principals and community leaders and the mayor's office, and everybody involved in that community it's all of our jobs. It's the village. We talked about that's been around forever. It's the village. And I do think that the people that are going to be most impacted are going to be the parents. Like I said, the parents need to understand what's going on. There's so many different words and terminology that we use in education. It's overwhelming. We're known, for that, and so we've got to make it simple, transparent. For teachers, we've got to make the data really easy to read, visible, very simple, because I liken the work we do at education as the work that doctors do. We try to diagnose an issue and we try to prescribe a solution. And so if we take that approach and we think as futurists, knowing that every single day is going to be different and that tomorrow might bring something very different, we've got to look for, like we said earlier, like a futurist, we've got to look for unfolding trends and patterns and external signals that we get to be a sense maker. And this is all work that I've read from Laura McBain's work at the Stanford D School. Design thinking, another big thing we'll talk about. But we've got to be able to make sure that we understand that we're there for the students. We're not there for the adults. We're there for, it should be, we've had this discussion year after year. Are we focused on teachers? Are we focused on students? Are we teacher-centric? Are we student-centric? We go back and forth on different products and programs that EdTech puts out there. I'm of the mindset that we have to really change teachers' behavior and their mindsets there. It starts with the teacher. The teacher is the most important part of this whole mixture, this whole bag of education that we know it. So I really think that if we can start thinking more like futurists, you know what I mean? That'll take us a long way. I mean, just adapting, because that's our role. My job is to teach you, Ross, to be adaptive, because you're going to have 5 more jobs. So how do I help you get the next job with skill sets that you need to have in order to get the next job? When you see something's happening, you're seeing a trend, maybe your job's going to end here in 2 weeks. What's my plan? How am I going to get that next job? What are my skill sets? What do I do well? What's my strength? Those kinds of things, I think that's our job as educators, to get them prepared for the next level.
Closing the gap is the most pressing issue in education today. Teachers need to observe their students while they teach to see where engagement drops and confusion sets in. They also need to create small group lessons that directly address knowledge gaps. eGlass is helping teachers close the knowledge gap. It's an illuminated glass writing board with a built-in camera. eGlass enables teachers to write on a board without ever turning their backs to students. It also enables them to record lessons as they teach, giving students learning resources that feel personal and one-to-one. Learn more about eGlass at eglass.io. A lot of it does go back to collaboration. So you talked about some work with the Stanford Design School and a lot of the really interesting work they're doing on design thinking. And I think there are a lot of really interesting things happening in school districts around whether it's partnering with industry or working with some outside collaborators to understand, I guess, in a sense, educators are really expert at what they do, but they don't know everything about every profession, right? But we know that the students in our school could be doing anything and everything, and we have them in schools for however many years, 13 years, 17 years, depending on if they go into higher ed or whatever. But what they're learning is preparing them for the next 50 years. And the world's going to look very different by then. How do we basically combine those skill sets of what we know we do really well as educators, of educating students, preparing them, but also bringing in other knowledge from people in other fields who know about some different things, right? So that we're combining that really for the best of students. I think that's an interesting thing that is kind of another way of thinking to kind of expand on some of what you were talking about.
What you're getting into for me really is the movement towards more public-private partnerships and bringing in businesses. And the interesting, ironic thing about that is, in terms of Steve Benjamin and ASCD article he writes that in education, large size is a problem. It's not an economic cost benefit. He suggests that schools should be modeled after the family, not like big business, because it has attends to economies of scale. And so the movement that I see also is supporting the whole family unit, particularly with a lot of the immigrant families that we're seeing coming in. We should focus on the whole family, not just the student. We should focus on the grandfather or the uncle or the aunt that's living with them there in that house, watching the kids while the parents are out looking for work or trying to learn English. So there's a whole movement towards dual generational teaching and learning that we should be thinking about as well. Education is very complex. It's very, very complex. The stakeholders you talk about, everybody has their own way. But I think through advanced technologies that are coming down in terms of helping us bring in the social emotional aspects, the behavioral aspects, checking on attendance, some of the main factors of teachers we know that are going to impact teaching and learning. Having that for us on dashboards is coming. It's here now. We can see different levels of what's important to me as a superintendent, as a assistant soup, as a site leader, site principal, as a teacher, as a student, as a parent. So it's self-agency in that area, and I think it's all of us taking advantage of that and helping us move more towards that diagnostic prescriptive model that I think we need to be doing as educators, and always knowing that tomorrow's going to be different, and let's adapt and let's be flexible and not be so rote and so scripted in our we have to be on page 37 in my textbook by next Wednesday. That's not the thinking we need to be having right now.
Right. Yeah, and I think so. To those points about one, you mentioned, sort of that the model of diagnose and prescribe, right, with addressing challenges and needs, and then that future is thinking ahead to what's coming along. I think those concepts apply really urgently right now to what's happening with funding. And when we think about the various ESSER funds, the other COVID relief packages that give such uh, broad opportunity to districts to not just be meeting immediate, challenges of COVID response, but to really plan for things that are upcoming. A lot. There's so many opportunities in there, and I think a lot of times, of course, by nature, because funding typically is allocated into specific buckets, a lot of time that guides the decision. Okay, there's funding available for X, so we should look at X. But in this case, this is an unanticipated right, packages that kind of give so many different uses, and it can be almost paralyzing because it's so surprising. You don't usually have that much flexibility, but what are some of the goals to those ends when you're thinking about kind of prescribing, okay, what are some of the challenges? And now we're diagnosing the challenges, and now we have the opportunity to prescribe. We have the resources. Some of the goals that districts should be looking at and trying to address in this current time when this funding is available, while it's here, like making the most impact with it.
100%, Ross. I really believe that superintendents that are great leaders don't think about just today. They think about 5 years from now, what's going to be happening, and how I'm going to use those funds to really make a difference in how I can sustain it. If districts are going out and they're hiring personnel and getting people in 2 or 3 years, when that money dries up, what are you going to do then? So you have to have a different plan on how you're going to use those funds. And I'm seeing a movement now towards what we've learned from the pandemic, like our friend Alberto Carvalho. He's going to bring in a new cabinet level officer to his district in Miami-Dade, chief health officer, as part of his cabinet after what we've experienced with this pandemic now, which makes sense because we're likening what we do to medicine, right? Well, let's just do that, because now we know that we have to deal with future pandemics, and this Delta virus and the Theta and the Zeta and the next ones that are come down the line aren't going away. So
Right.
health is going to be a big part of it. I'm seeing a movement towards school districts partnering with the healthcare industry and setting up their own emergency centers and their own testing centers and getting more involved in communities that way. I'm seeing a lot of innovation, to your point earlier, Ross, like this e-glass we talked about. The idea of changing the way we're instructing in the classrooms, so we can do both in class and remote teaching at the same time simultaneously. If we had a product like that 2 years ago, teachers wouldn't be burned out right now from hybrid teaching. That's one of the biggest problems I've seen, is that it taxed and burdened a lot of our teachers that had to teach 4 or 5 kids in the class and 20 kids at home. The movement towards healthcare, right now we need more and more counselors and mental support, because kids have had a tough time the last couple of years. So now we're seeing a shift and movement towards more social emotional support and mental health supports in schools. And so how do we bring in more of that help and those resources to help us with our day-to-day lives as teachers? And how do we bring in mental health experts, and how do we test, for COVID? And how do we do, one of the things we talked about in California here is we're in declining enrollment. A lot of districts are losing students. And so we have to think about that. We have to think about the future of that. So as a superintendent, I'm just thinking, You have to plan for the future, because if we don't do that, we'll go back to 2008 levels of funding, and we're going to be cutting people and going back to the same old thing. So right now, we should be innovating how we're going to use those funds to sustain what we can do for the next 10 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and there is a lot of urgency around that now because now is when it's available. But it's looking ahead to say if we make the right decisions now, we're preparing ourselves for the next several years, and that makes it all the more important to make the right calls to
So if I can
evaluate.
add, Ross, to add to that thought, I would be investing in my teachers. I would
Yeah,
be investing in them. I would be investing in more resources and support for my teachers, not buying some widget.
right,
Let's make a better teacher. Maybe
right.
the widget is really impactful. It'll help me. It's going to help me. But I'm just saying, let's not invest in widgets and shiny objects. Let's invest in our teachers, make them better teachers. That's where I put my money.
Yeah, yeah. There's no better time for that than now, given it's been a challenging time, and it's a lot of teachers, given everything that's going on, reevaluating their place in the profession, and for districts to establish that they're really investing in their growth and support. I mean, nothing could mean more for students, right, than starting there. So that would be a huge thing. Tom, I'm going to throw you. I'm not sure if this is a bounce pass or an alley oop. You can you
I'll
can
take it.
let me
I'll take it
know.
either way. I'll take it either way. Alley oop it. I
I
can't jump
know.
anymore, so it's probably a bounce pass, Ross.
Right, we'll keep it balanced fast. So I know you're an avid basketball player, and for our listeners that don't know this, you were actually on the over 64 Mexican national team at the World Championships a couple years ago. So the question is, what can EdTech leaders learn from basketball players?
That's a great question. I went to go watch when I was in Helsinki a couple years ago for the championships. They had a team of 80-year-olds out there, and I really enjoyed that watching them. They played Russia. USA played Russia in the final game. There were about 7 or 8 countries at that age bracket, and I went up to them after the game. I said, "You guys are my idols," and they looked at me and they said, "Son, the secret to our success is that you got to keep moving." So that's my advice for people in education. We got to keep moving. Got to keep moving forward. We have to eat right. We have to move. We got to keep moving. We can't be stationary. We can't be static. We have to move. So that's why I'm going back to the analogy with the status quo. This is our time to really make great changes and transform public education as we know it. If we don't do it now, we'll never do it.
Yeah.
So keep
I,
moving.
yeah, that's a perfect answer for a question that you could not have known was coming, and yet that's exactly right. Especially in a system that over a long period of time didn't experience too much change, and yet now a lot of opportunities are there for innovation and to really just keep saying, like, every day take that next step to really do what's best for educators, for students. Thank you, Tom, for that roundup and for sharing your valuable expertise. And thank you to our listeners. If you're not subscribed yet, please do give us a follow on your favorite podcast app. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, we'd appreciate if you rate and review so more tech leaders can find out about the show. And we'll catch you next time on the COSIN Podcast. Thank you for listening to this episode of the COSIN Podcast, produced in partnership with MindRocket Media Group. Visit mindrocketmediagroup.com to connect with our expert team and learn how we can support your education industry, communications, and marketing goals. And to make sure you never miss an episode of the podcast, subscribe on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. You can also listen to each new episode on edcircuit.com or cosin.org.